Hey, what's going on, guys? We have some massive breaking news. Anthony Joshua versus Francis Ngannou is official. A 10-round boxing match going down on March 9th in Saudi Arabia as part of the Riyadh season. And this is mega news for Francis Ngannou, the guy who just continually fumbles the bag over and over and over again. I mean, this is craziness. For a guy that's been doubted for literally years, who's been shit on for literally years, just got one of the biggest names in the sport in Anthony Joshua in a fight that I think a lot of people think Francis Ngannou can win. And I'm going to get to my early prediction later in this video. But it's going down March 9th in Saudi Arabia as part of the Riyadh season. Ariel Helwani broke the news maybe an hour ago. I was on my way to a birthday party. I saw this news. I said, no, I got to go home. I got to go home because I want to take a victory lap. If you guys have not watched my Francis Ngannou videos over the past year, I have an entire Francis Ngannou playlist, which I will link down in the description. But this just further cements it. I mean, we already knew it to be true once he signed the PFL deal, but then he signed the Tyson Fury fight, arguably won the Tyson Fury fight, and now he's fighting Anthony Joshua, a fight that people are actually giving him a chance in, and if he wins that, all bets are off for what Francis Ngannou can do. He could be the biggest combat sports star, period. Imagine he goes out there and knocks out Anthony Joshua. Imagine that timeline. I mean, it is craziness. Francis Ngannou, his last MMA fight, he goes in with a torn ACL, defeats Cyril Gane, lost the first 2 rounds, comes back and wins the last 3 rounds. Gambled on himself, coming off a long layoff with a torn ACL, goes out there and beats up Cyril Gane and defends his title. The fight before that, folded Stipe Miocic like a lawn chair. Oh, by the way, that's the same guy that's getting a heavyweight title shot in 2024, which is an absolute disgrace. And throughout that whole time period, Francis is trying to negotiate with the UFC. And one of the major sticking points was Francis Ngannou wanted the ability to go box. And Dana White didn't want Francis Ngannou to be able to go box, and they didn't want to pay him what he thought he was worth. And you have BKFC's president, and you have One Championship's president. And I may do a second video. If you guys want to see a second video of me pulling up clips of different promoters and Chael Sonnen as well, which we'll talk about a little bit in this video, shitting on Francis Ngannou and reacting to those in 2024, let me know. Because I think that honestly deserves its own video itself. And by the way, Chael Sonnen is putting on his shoes and socks right now, absolutely seething, heading to his studio to cross and uncross his legs to somehow spin this as a negative for Francis Ngannou. Do you remember that MMA Hour interview where Chael was like, no, they only do 3-fight deals. These one-offs, that just doesn't happen. He's not gonna get this. He's gonna head back to PFL with his tail between his legs and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Remember that, Chael Sonnen? The guy who was a literal UFC shill, a UFC propagandist. I wonder what he does now. Because Chael Sonnen, he twists himself into pretzels to somehow benefit the UFC in the form of twisting the narrative among fans. The truth is here, guys, Francis Ngannou made the best decision he could make for himself, and it has taken a life of its own, and it has worked out better than anyone could have ever imagined, because he got paid $10 to $20 million for fighting Tyson Fury, okay? He got paid $10 to $20 million, more than he made in his entire UFC career. Now, he's fighting Anthony Joshua, coming off an arguable win against Tyson Fury, again in Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia, you have to understand, to the people in Saudi Arabia, literally somebody like Dana White is poor to them. They could buy the UFC, the literal UFC, the whole entire company, they could buy it as chump change. So you have to understand, to them, they just want to put on a spectacle. That's why they pay all these high-end celebrities to come to the events as well, like, you know, Ronaldo and stuff like that, where you have Conor McGregor coked up sitting next to him. And Francis Ngannou now, against Anthony Joshua, we haven't heard any financials yet. But I would guess it would probably be somewhere around $30 million Francis Ngannou is going to make. That is generational wealth right there for Francis Ngannou. Keep in mind, he already has a deal with PFL to fight in MMA, and it's the largest contract in MMA heavyweight history. He already has that. Now, he may never even go to World Series of Fighting. He may never even go to PFL, which was formerly World Series of Fighting. So, I don't know. World Series of Fighting may have, I don't know why I keep calling it World Series of Fighting. PFL may have very well lost out on this deal, because Imagine Ngannou goes and beats Anthony Joshua. Imagine he goes and beats Anthony Joshua. I struggle to see a world where Francis Ngannou ever returns to MMA. Why would he return to PFL to fight for $10 million or a little bit more than $10 million plus all the benefits that they gave him? I guess because they did him a solid. They signed him to this deal that gave him the ability to go out and box. But at the end of the day, if he beats Anthony Joshua, you're talking $50 million paydays. You're talking $50 million paydays. Francis Ngannou has set himself up to potentially be richer than the richest athlete that ever, or richest MMA fighter that people always talk about in Conor McGregor. That's what Francis Ngannou has set himself up for. And think about this. All the fans going against him because he left the UFC. Dana White, and this is why I got to make a second video. Dana White saying, Francis Ngannou wants to fight lesser competition for more money. That couldn't be more wrong. Francis Ngannou sought out the toughest possible fights he could ever seek out. And guess what? He's made a career out of it now. Because after this next fight, he could never fight MMA or boxing again. He is set. His whole entire family's set. His kids' are set. That's how well Francis Ngannou is doing. And this fight against Anthony Joshua is going to get a lot of publicity. I know there was a lot of talk of pay-per-view buys, and we never had reliable sources reporting on Tyson Fury, Francis Ngannou pay-per-view buys. But a lot of people didn't expect Francis Ngannou to put up a competitive fight. Also, it was on in the middle of the afternoon. Also, you had propagandist Chael Sonnen, Dana White, and all the other fans supporting that narrative that, yeah, Francis Ngannou doesn't have a chance. And in their defense, I totally understand that narrative. Oh, it's an MMA fighter coming off an ACL surgery, out for a while, fighting a top tier, considered one of the greatest boxers in the sport, heavyweight boxers in the sport. I understand counting him out in the fight, but he went out there and look at the performance he put on. The general consensus was that Francis Ngannou won that fight. So guess what? People are going to be interested to see how Francis Ngannou can now do against somebody like Anthony Joshua, who's one of the top names in the sport. And to be honest, I think, I would never doubt Francis Ngannou again. And if you think about the circumstances heading into that Tyson Fury fight, okay, he's coming off a long layoff. He hadn't fought since January of 2022. And now he was fighting or boxing in October of 2023 in a sport he's never competed in. He's now not competed in any form of combat sports for over a year and a half. And he's returning against one of the greatest heavyweight boxers. He goes out there and drops him and arguably beats him. And I believe he did beat him and got robbed by the judges. So think about this. That was his first ever just prioritizing boxing training camp. Now, if he has a second training camp where prioritizing boxing yet again for a guy like Anthony Joshua, all bets are off. Francis Ngannou has shown throughout the course of his MMA career that he gets better with every single fight. Look at the wrestling that he mixed in against Cyril Gane. We never really seen Francis Ngannou mix that in before. We never really seen Francis Ngannou go out there and attempt to use technical boxing ability. And we saw it against Tyson Fury, and it looked incredible. It looked incredible. And now you have another 6 months, October to March, roughly 6 months. And you have another training camp for Francis Ngannou where he can kind of polish his skills. You have the fact that now he's been in there with a top-tier boxer. He knows what it feels like to be in there with a top-tier boxer. And he's going to go in there against a guy like Anthony Joshua who, from what I've been told, I haven't seen a lot of Anthony Joshua fights. He has a little bit of a suspect chin. He's been rocked quite a few times. He's been hit on the chin quite a few times. Francis Ngannou arguably has the best power in combat sports. It would not be crazy to suggest that Francis Ngannou could go out there and brutally KO him. It would not, and just even if he's not able to do that, it would not be crazy to go out there and suggest that Francis Ngannou could go out there and win a decision. He arguably won a decision against Tyson Fury. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I've researched this fight in depth in terms of skill for skill and technical ability, because I'm not a guy who watches a lot of boxing. I've seen a little bit of Anthony Joshua. I will research it a little bit more before I do a prediction for this boxing match, because guess what? If you've been watching this channel for the last 2 years, you know I'm not a boxing fan. Francis Ngannou has turned me into a boxing fan. I will undoubtedly be watching that pay-per-view. I will undoubtedly be purchasing that pay-per-view. I'll be happy to put a little bit of my revenue, the little bit of my purchase price in Francis Ngannou's pocket. I will be happy to do that, because this is a guy that came from nothing. Fought in the UFC, became UFC heavyweight undisputed champion, and then the UFC tried to bully him. He refused to accept the way they tried to bully him and ice him and sit him on the sidelines and set narratives. And he fought out his contract. He got out of his contract and he set a precedent. I talked about this in a video yesterday about John Jones, Tom Aspinall, Stipe Miocic situation. Francis Ngannou, once he did not come to terms with the UFC wanted to use him as a cautionary tale. And that's why you saw Dana White really go out there and try to push a certain narrative regarding Francis Ngannou. All the regurgitated talking points we've seen time and time again. I'm not going to go over them in this video. I've already talked about them plenty of times. You've seen it from Dana White and you've seen it from Chael Sonnen quite a bit as well. And what happens is a lot of MMA fans have such brand loyalty to Dana White and to the UFC, and they sycophantically worship Dana White. In their minds, they can't use critical thinking and they can't think, you know what? Maybe this isn't true. Maybe Francis Ngannou did make the right decision. And I don't understand how anyone could ever think when Francis was leaving the UFC, they think of the UFC and Dana White as the smartest businessmen ever. And Dana White even came out and said we offered him a mega deal to make him the top heavyweight paid fighter in UFC history. They heard that news and they say Francis Ngannou's greedy. They listened to BKFC and won championship, President Chatri Sichitong or whatever the hell his name is. By the way, it's being rumored now that one championship might go under. So much for them offering, $20 million to Francis Ngannou. Guess what? Everyone that called him greedy, everyone that called him dumb, look what he's done now. But what happened is Dana White and Chael Sonnen turned all the fans against Francis Ngannou, and they didn't have the ability to think if the best company in the world, according to them, the biggest promoter, the smartest people in Dana White and all his little buddies and Hunter Campbell, if they wanted to sign Francis Ngannou to this massive deal, then why wouldn't another company? Why wouldn't another company want to give him an opportunity? And now you have the PFL deal that's always in his back pocket. You have the Anthony Joshua fight. And even if he goes out there and is competitive in that fight, he still has a future in boxing. He can go knock out basically anyone on the roster over at PFL and collect an easy $10 million check plus any pay-per-view points, which, by the way, everyone laughing, oh, Francis can't sell pay-per-views, blah, blah, blah. I bet you this pay-per-view against Anthony Joshua does well. I bet you, let's say he goes out there, he's competitive against Anthony Joshua. And then he says, you know what, PFL gave me this deal. I know I could go continue to box, but I'm going to go have a fight in PFL like I promised them. Let me go over to PFL. I guarantee people will be tuning in now more than ever. I guarantee, I don't know to what degree of success it will have, but it will have success. And if I was PFL, though, I'd be a little bit worried. I got to be honest. As much as I said, shout out to PFL for attempting to kind of break barriers and make headway in the sport by signing Francis Ngannou to this mega deal, by, signing the entire Bellator roster, buying Bellator in general. I have to admit, I'd be a little bit worried if I'm them, because Francis Ngannou goes out there and let's say he beats Anthony Joshua. He's looking at 50, 60, maybe even more than that, $1 million paydays. So when you're looking back at that PFL deal and you're like, oh, 10 million, you know what? That you can keep those crumbs. But I don't think Francis Ngannou will do that. Maybe they'll restructure his contract. But think about this. I'll leave you guys with this. And I'm going to make another video about this in the future. Imagine the hype. Imagine the hype if the UFC would have said, okay, Francis, you can go box Tyson Fury. He goes out there, drops Tyson Fury, arguably beats Tyson Fury. Then he comes back to fight John Jones to unify the heavyweight championship. Imagine how big that fight would be. Imagine how big that fight would be. It would be massive. Then imagine, okay, he goes box Anthony Joshua. Maybe he beats John Jones. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe then he goes, okay, well, I'm going to go box Anthony Joshua. Now, maybe, obviously, circumstances matter, and maybe that wouldn't happen. Then imagine he has a competitive fight there or wins that fight. I mean, the sky would have been the limit for his star power, even in the UFC. And the UFC could have been collecting a cut of that. That's why the UFC allowed Conor McGregor to go box Floyd Mayweather, because the UFC, let's say Conor got paid $50 million, the UFC said, we'll take half. We'll take half. Guess what? Francis Ngannou gets those full paychecks from Saudi Arabia, and it's more than we could have ever imagined. He's taken this situation, and I thought he will be just fine. He'll do just fine going off the PFL. He'll be just fine if he gets a one-off boxing match and maybe makes it a little bit competitive, but even if he loses. and he would make more money and have more freedom than he ever could have hoped for in the UFC. And now look where he's at. So much for fumble in the bag. So much for fumble in the bag for Francis Ngannou. And I'm picking Francis Ngannou in this boxing match. And I have to admit right now, there's a degree of bias in that because I haven't watched a lot of boxing footage and I've only seen the one boxing match of Francis Ngannou. So obviously when we get closer, I'll make a legitimate prediction, but it doesn't matter. Francis has already won. He's already won. The only people that truly lose in this situation are the fans who wanted to see Francis Ngannou, Jon Jones, which, by the way, also I would have picked. I would have picked Francis Ngannou over Jon Jones, especially after seeing that Tyson Fury matchup, which is just craziness. But the UFC could have got a cut of that. They could have had Francis come back and fight Jon Jones to unify the belts, and it would have been just fine. But so much for, yeah, Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag. Francis Ngannou made a mistake. He should have signed with one championship. He should have signed with BKFC. All those promoters, all those promoters, BKFC, I don't even remember the guy's name. BKFC's probably going to go out of business in a couple years. Then you have one championship, Chatri Sityodtong, who's literally a snake oil salesman. You have those guys using Francis Ngannou as a media vehicle to promote themselves, to promote their companies, because their companies aren't doing that great. That's why. And Francis Ngannou was just an easy punching bag when he's sitting silent on the sidelines, recovering from an ACL injury. And now he's returned with a vengeance, and I cannot wait. I cannot wait to see Francis Ngannou versus Anthony Joshua March 9th in Saudi Arabia. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you turn on notifications. I'll be doing a live watch along for that. And I have to applaud Francis Ngannou. I mean, has anyone ever navigated a career in the capacity that Francis Ngannou has navigated his career? And by the way, Eric Nixtick came out the other day, did an interview, the coach of Francis Ngannou, and said the money that Francis Ngannou paid him from the Tyson Fury training camp changed his life. Changed his life. So it couldn't happen to a better person. Let me know down in the comments. We're talking Eddie Hearn. We're talking, Anthony Joshua. We're talking Dana White saying, oh, gimmick fights and this and that, blah, blah, blah. And Chael Sonnen as well, talking nonstop crap about Francis Ngannou. We're going to call him out in a future video in the next couple days or so. So let me know in the comments who you want me to call out in that video, because I can't remember everyone that's been kind of crapping on him over the last year or so. But Francis Ngannou did the best thing he could do for his haters, and that is succeed. And I couldn't be happier for him. What a story he has. What a life story he has, even if it ends and he retires after the Anthony Joshua fight. What an amazing story that is for Francis Ngannou. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.